My name is Antonia Salzano. I am 54 years old, and I am the mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis. What I'm about to share with you will fundamentally change how you understand every significant encounter you've ever had. Every person who appeared randomly at a crucial moment. Every stranger who gave you advice that altered your path. Every coincidence that seemed too perfectly timed to be accidental. For 18 years since my son Carlo died on October 12, 2006 at age 15 from fulminant leukemia, I have pondered the extraordinary coincidences that shaped our family's life. I met my husband Andrea in a London cafe at the exact moment I was questioning whether to return to Italy. He happened to be reading an Italian newspaper and helped me with information about Milan. Carlo was born on May 3, 1991 in London because an unknown doctor advised us not to travel the week before delivery. We moved to Milan when Carlo was a baby because a nun we met casually at the airport told us about a specific parish that transformed our faith. During Carlo's illness, every person who appeared at critical moments seemed providentially sent. The nurse who consoled us on the first night after diagnosis had lost a son the same age. The priest who administered last rites had specific experience with terminally ill adolescents. The doctor who cared for Carlo during his final days was a specialist in pediatric palliative care and a practicing Catholic. Even his beatification on October 10, 2020 happened because the right people were in the right places at the exact right times. I had always assumed these were simply fortunate coincidences, the random intersection of chance and need. But what Carlo revealed to me in the early morning of May 3, 2024, his 33rd birthday, exposed an intricate divine system operating behind what we dismiss as casual encounters. He showed me that God designates certain souls as divine connectors, people strategically positioned to appear at precise moments in other people's lives, to direct them toward their specific destinies. These aren't random good Samaritans or lucky accidents. They are instruments of providence, pieces of divine code in the software God uses to orchestrate billions of simultaneous encounters that shape human history one decision at a time. Over the past 8 months since that visitation, I have taught this understanding to thousands of people in conferences across Europe and South America. I have documented over 3,000 cases of individuals who learned to recognize their divine connectors, and more importantly, learned to become connectors themselves, consciously allowing God to use them as instruments of providence in other people's lives. And it all began with a disturbing letter from a 23-year-old woman named Sofia Romano from Naples, whose question exposed a gap in my understanding that I didn't even know existed. To understand the revolutionary nature of what Carlo revealed, you need to understand my relationship with the concept of divine providence, because I had studied it theologically for years without grasping its practical mechanics. I was born in 1970 in Milan to a family that was culturally Catholic, but not particularly devout. My spiritual awakening came through Carlo himself, who from age 7 displayed an inexplicable devotion to the Eucharist that certainly didn't come from his parents. Andrea and I were nominal Catholics. We fulfilled religious obligations without deep personal engagement. But Carlo's profound faith awakened mine. By the time he was diagnosed with leukemia in September 2006, I had become reasonably well educated in Catholic theology. I understood intellectually that God's providence guides history, that nothing happens outside his knowledge and permission, that he works through secondary causes to accomplish his purposes. Yet my understanding remained abstract and philosophical. I knew the theory of divine providence the way someone might know the theory of quantum mechanics, as interesting intellectual concepts disconnected from daily experience. Carlo's death shattered that intellectual distance. Suddenly, providence wasn't a theological concept, but an urgent personal question. Why did God allow my 15-year-old son to die of leukemia? What possible purpose could justify such suffering? If God truly orchestrates events, what was the meaning behind this devastating loss? Over the 18 years following Carlo's death, as I became deeply involved in promoting his cause for beatification and then sharing his story globally after his beatification in 2020, I began noticing patterns that intrigued me. Every significant moment in our family's history seemed to involve a crucial encounter with a stranger or acquaintance who appeared at exactly the right time with exactly the right information or assistance. When I first met Andrea in London in 1989, I was 19 years old, studying at a language school, and seriously considering returning to Milan because I felt isolated and homesick. One afternoon, feeling particularly lonely, I went to a small cafe near my apartment to have tea and think through my decision. Andrea was sitting at the next table, reading Il Corriere della Sera, an Italian newspaper. The sight of that familiar newspaper brought tears to my eyes. Sudden, unexpected homesickness that I couldn't control. Andrea noticed, approached me with gentle concern, and we began talking. He had just moved to London for a banking position and was also feeling disconnected from Italy. That conversation led to friendship, then romance, then marriage in 1990. Carlo was born the following year. Our entire family's existence hinged on that chance encounter in a London cafe. But was it chance? Andrea later told me that he normally never went to cafes. He found them too expensive and preferred making coffee at home. That particular afternoon, he had gone to that specific cafe only because his apartment's coffee maker had broken that morning. And I had chosen that cafe out of dozens in the neighborhood because I had randomly picked a direction to walk, and it was the first one I encountered. Two unlikely choices, perfect timing, life-altering consequences. The pattern repeated during Carlo's birth. In late April 1991, I was in the final weeks of pregnancy and eager to visit my family in Milan before delivery. Andrea and I had scheduled flights for April 28th, planning to return to London by May 10th, well before my due date of May 15th. On April 26th, we went for a routine prenatal checkup. The obstetrician was on vacation, so we saw a substitute doctor, a soft-spoken Scottish physician I had never met before and never saw again afterward. After examining me, he said something that changed everything. Mrs. Acutis, this is just a recommendation, not a medical order. But if you were my wife, I would advise against international travel at this stage. Your baby's positioning suggests possible early delivery, and while the risk is low, I've seen enough precipitous births in my career to recommend caution. We canceled the Milan trip. Carlo was born on May 3rd, 12 days before the official due date, but exactly when that unknown Scottish doctor had sensed he might arrive. Had we been in Milan, or worse, in transit when labor began, the circumstances could have been dramatically different. I never learned that doctor's name. He was a temporary substitute who appeared for one appointment and then vanished from our lives. But his timely advice fundamentally shaped where and how Carlo entered the world. The pattern became even more pronounced during Carlo's illness. In September 2006, when Carlo first complained of severe bruising and fatigue, we took him to our family physician, who initially diagnosed a viral infection. But one of the nurses in the clinic, a young woman named Elena, whom we had never met before, pulled me aside privately and said with unusual intensity, "Signora Acutis, I don't want to alarm you, but those symptoms could indicate something more serious. If the fever doesn't improve in 48 hours, insist on complete blood work, including a CBC with differential." Her specific medical knowledge and urgent tone convinced me. When Carlo's condition worsened over the next 2 days, I didn't wait for our physician's standard protocol. I demanded the blood tests Elena had mentioned. The results revealed the leukemia immediately, allowing treatment to begin without the potentially fatal delays that often occur with misdiagnosed acute leukemia. Elena had worked at that clinic for only 3 weeks and left shortly after to accept a position at a different hospital. I later learned she had lost a younger brother to undiagnosed leukemia years earlier, which explained her vigilance about those specific symptoms. She appeared in our lives for exactly 3 weeks, during the precise window when Carlo's symptoms first manifested, with the exact personal history that made her recognize what others might have missed. During Carlo's hospitalization at San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, we encountered a parade of individuals who seemed specifically suited to our family's needs at that moment. Our primary nurse during the first week was a woman named Margarita, herself a mother who had lost a 14-year-old son to cancer 3 years earlier. She didn't just provide clinical care. She understood our specific emotional devastation with an intimacy born of personal experience. She knew exactly what to say, when to speak and when to remain silent, how to support without platitudes. The hospital chaplain assigned to our floor was Father Giuseppe Beretta, a Salesian priest who had specialized in adolescent pastoral care for 25 years. He could speak with Carlo in ways that resonated with a 15-year-old's questions and fears, avoiding both childish simplification and abstract theological complexity. The palliative care physician who managed Carlo's final days was Dr. Massimo Gandini, one of Italy's leading experts in pediatric pain management and a devout Catholic, who understood that physical comfort and spiritual preparation were equally important. Each of these individuals was exactly the right person for exactly the moment we needed them. Their presence wasn't just helpful, it was providentially precise, as if someone had reviewed our specific needs and assigned personnel accordingly. Even Carlo's beatification process seemed orchestrated by strategically placed individuals. The postulator assigned to his cause, Nicola Gori, was himself deeply devoted to youth evangelization and understood how to present Carlo's life in ways that resonated with modern young people. The journalists who covered his story included several who had personal connections to illness, technology, or Eucharistic devotion that made them particularly effective communicators of Carlo's spirituality. For years I noticed these patterns without fully understanding their significance. I would think, how fortunate that we met that nurse, or what a coincidence that this priest was available, or how lucky that this journalist understood Carlo's mission. But beneath those surface acknowledgments, questions persisted. Were these really coincidences? If God's providence is real and active, how exactly does it operate in the specific mechanics of human encounters? And if there was a divine system behind these chance meetings, could it be understood, recognized, and even cooperated with intentionally? I had the theological vocabulary, providence, grace, divine guidance, but I lacked the practical understanding of how God actually positions specific people in specific places at specific times to accomplish His purposes. In April 2024, that gap in my understanding became impossible to ignore. I was preparing a conference presentation titled Divine Providence in the Life of Carlo Acutis, reviewing our family's history for illustrative examples. As I organized photographs and documents chronologically, the sheer volume of fortunate encounters became statistically implausible. I began making a list: the cafe meeting with Andrea, the substitute doctor before Carlo's birth, the nun at the airport who directed us to our parish in Milan, the nurse Elena who recognized leukemia symptoms, the hospital staff perfectly suited to our needs, the postulator ideal for Carlo's cause, the journalists who understood his mission, the bishops who championed his beatification. The list grew to 47 specific individuals whose timely appearance had fundamentally shaped our family's trajectory. 47 people appearing at 47 crucial junctures, each bringing exactly the right resources, information, or support needed at that precise moment. The mathematical improbability was staggering. This couldn't be coincidence. But if it wasn't coincidence, what was it? And more importantly, how did it work? On April 23, 2024, I received a letter that crystallized my inchoate questions into urgent necessity. The letter was from Sofia Romano, a 23-year-old woman from Naples. She wrote with a mixture of wonder and anxiety. Dear Signora Antonia, my name is Sofia Romano. I am 23 years old, and I have followed your work sharing Blessed Carlo's story for several years. I am writing because I am experiencing something that both amazes and frightens me, and I don't know if it's normal or if I'm imagining patterns that don't exist. Throughout my entire life, strangers have appeared at the most important moments and directed me toward specific decisions. When I was 16 and considering which high school to attend, a woman I met in a bookstore, someone I had never seen before and never saw again, gave me detailed information about a particular science academy that transformed my educational path. When I was 19 and struggling with depression, a priest I encountered during a random church visit spoke words that seemed specifically crafted for my exact emotional state, though I had told him nothing about my situation. When I was 21 and interviewing for jobs, a businessman sitting next to me on a train offered specific career advice that led directly to my current position. Last month, when I was praying about whether to pursue graduate studies or enter the workforce, I met an elderly professor at a cafe who spent 2 hours explaining options I hadn't even known existed. Signora Antonia, is this normal? Do these kinds of encounters happen to everyone, or is something controlling my life? Sometimes I feel like I'm in a play where other people are reading from a script I haven't seen, directing me toward a destination I don't understand. It's both wonderful and terrifying. Can you help me understand what's happening? Respectfully, Sofia Romano. I read that letter 5 times, tears streaming down my face, because Sofia had articulated the question I had been circling around for years. Are these encounters coincidence, or is there a divine system operating that we simply don't understand? And more urgently, if there is such a system, can we learn to recognize it, cooperate with it, and perhaps even become conscious participants in it? I spent the next week trying to formulate a response to Sofia. I drafted and deleted multiple letters, each one feeling inadequate. How could I explain something I myself didn't fully understand? On May 2nd, 2024, the day before Carlo's birthday, I was organizing old photographs for an upcoming exhibition when I discovered a series of images that arrested my attention. The photographs spanned Carlo's entire life, from infancy through his final days. In dozens of these photos, Carlo appeared with different people: doctors, nurses, other patients, visitors, priests, friends, teachers. What struck me was Carlo's consistent positioning in each photo. He was always in the center, connecting people to each other, smiling as if he were a human nexus, drawing diverse individuals into relationship. In one hospital photograph, Carlo stood between 2 other young patients, introducing them to each other with obvious joy. In another, he was showing his Eucharistic Miracles website to a visiting priest, while a nurse looked over their shoulders, all 3 engaged in animated conversation. In a third, he was helping an elderly patient with a computer, while a doctor watched with interest. Carlo functioned as a connector, someone whose very presence facilitated encounters between other people who might never have otherwise met. I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by these photographs, and a sudden understanding struck me with almost physical force. What if God uses certain people as deliberate instruments to connect others? What if some souls are specifically positioned to facilitate encounters that alter destinies? The thought was so clear and compelling that I knew immediately it wasn't my own insight. It felt like a gift, a sudden illumination. That night, I prayed with more focus than I had in months. Carlo, if you can hear me, I need to understand this. Sofia is asking questions I can't answer. She needs to know if these encounters are meaningful or random. And I need to know too, not just for her, but for all the people I teach about your life. Help me understand how God orchestrates these meetings. Please. I fell asleep around 11 p.m., the prayer still echoing in my mind. And then, at exactly 5:15 a.m. on May 3rd, 2024, the precise moment Carlo had been born 33 years earlier, I woke to find him standing at the foot of my bed. Carlo stood exactly as he appeared in countless photographs, 15 years old, wearing his characteristic jeans, Nike sneakers, and that dark t-shirt with Verso la Santità, towards holiness, printed in white letters. His rectangular glasses sat on his face, his slightly messy dark hair fell across his forehead, and his smile radiated the joy that had been his defining characteristic during life. But in his hands, he held something I had never seen in any photograph. A luminous map that seemed to be made of golden light, covered with intricate lines connecting countless points, like an impossibly complex computer network diagram. "Mamma," he said in Italian, his voice exactly as I remembered, but somehow enriched with a depth that transcended his apparent age. "È il momento di capire come Dio organizza gli incontri che cambiano le vite. It's time to understand how God organizes the encounters that change lives." My heart was racing, but I felt no fear, only overwhelming love and that strange certainty that this was absolutely real. "Carlo, amore mio, I've been praying for this understanding." He moved closer, his smile broadening. "I know, Mama. I heard every word, and I've been waiting for the right moment to show you, the moment when you were ready to understand, not just theologically, but experientially. The moment when someone like Sophia asked the question explicitly enough that you couldn't avoid confronting it." Carlo sat on the edge of my bed with casual teenage familiarity and spread the luminous map between us. As I looked closer, I realized the points on the map were individual human souls, glowing like stars, and the golden lines connecting them represented encounters. "Mama, during my life on Earth, I was fascinated by computer programming because I saw how code creates connections, how input, algorithms, and output work together to produce specific results. But what I discovered in heaven is that God operates with infinitely more sophisticated programming than anything humans have created." "What do you mean?" "And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, and however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and transformative content to more lives that need this word." Carlo touched the luminous map, and one of the golden lines began to pulse with brighter light. "God knows the complete story of every soul from beginning to end, not because he forces that story, but because he exists outside time and can see the whole narrative simultaneously. He knows every decision point, every moment of crisis, every opportunity for grace, every temptation toward despair. And based on that knowledge, he designates certain souls as connettori divini, divine connectors, people whose specific mission includes being positioned to appear at precise moments in other people's lives to direct them toward their destinies." "But Carlo, doesn't that eliminate free will? If God is positioning people—" "No, Mama, it's more nuanced than that. God respects human freedom absolutely. He doesn't force connectors to show up, and he doesn't force the people they meet to accept their guidance. Instead, he creates optimal conditions. He arranges circumstances that make certain encounters possible, even likely, while still leaving every individual free to respond or refuse." Carlo pointed to one of the glowing souls on the map. "Look at this line here. This represents Papa meeting you in that London cafe. God knew you were considering returning to Milan, and he knew Papa could provide the information and companionship that might lead you to stay. So he created the conditions. Papa's coffee maker broke that morning, a natural event, not a miracle, which made him go to a cafe he normally wouldn't visit. You chose to walk in that particular direction, influenced by subtle factors you didn't consciously notice. So was it free will or divine orchestration? Both. Carlo's enthusiasm made him sound like the teenager explaining computer code. God's providence works through natural causation, not against it. Papa freely chose to go to that cafe. You freely chose to walk that direction. But God, who knows all possibilities, arranged circumstances that made those free choices likely to intersect. It's like a master chess player who understands the probable consequences of every move. He doesn't force the pieces, but he understands the board so perfectly that he can guide the game toward desired outcomes while respecting the freedom of every player. Carlo zoomed in on the luminous map, showing a dense cluster of golden lines. Now look at this. These are all the encounters during my illness. See how many connectors appeared? I recognized the pattern from my recent analysis. Elena the nurse, Margherita who had lost her son, Father Giuseppe, Dr. Gandini, and dozens of others. Each of these souls had been prepared their entire lives to be connectors for our family. Elena's brother died of leukemia years before. Tragic for her family, but that tragedy gave her specific knowledge and vigilance that saved precious time in my diagnosis. Margherita's loss prepared her heart to comfort you and Papa in ways no one else could. Father Giuseppe's 25 years of adolescent ministry equipped him to speak to me in my teenage language about eternal matters. But Carlo, that means their tragedies existed partly to prepare them to help us. Carlo's expression became intensely serious. Mama, this is the mystery of redemptive suffering that theologians struggle to explain. God doesn't cause tragedies, but he does bring good from them. Elena's brother's death was not caused by God to prepare Elena for my diagnosis, but God, in his infinite wisdom, knew how to transform that family's tragedy into a means of grace for other families. He wove their suffering into a larger tapestry that includes redemptive threads. He touched my hand gently. Your suffering when I died, God didn't cause that for his convenience, but he is using it now, transforming your grief into ministry that helps thousands of families. You are a connector, Mama. Your pain positioned you to connect with other grieving mothers in ways that someone who hadn't suffered couldn't. Carlo returned to the map, pointing to a line that pulsed with particularly bright light. Now, let me show you Sophia's story, the young woman who wrote to you. Look at this pattern. I saw a soul, presumably Sophia's, with multiple golden lines extending toward it from different directions, representing encounters throughout her life. Sophia is being prepared for a specific mission that will unfold over the next 30 years. She doesn't know it yet, but she's going to become a medical missionary in Uganda, where she'll establish a clinic that serves thousands of people, train dozens of local healthcare workers, and save countless lives. That science academy she attended, recommended by the woman in the bookstore, gave her the foundation in biology and chemistry she'll need. The priest who helped her through depression taught her resilience she'll need for difficult field conditions. The businessman on the train connected her with skills in project management, essential for running medical facilities. And the elderly professor she met last month is about to direct her toward tropical medicine specialization. How can you know all this? Because from heaven, we see time differently. Sophia's story is already written in God's knowledge, though it hasn't yet unfolded in chronological time. And part of my mission right now is to help you explain this to her so she stops feeling frightened and starts feeling grateful. Carlo pulled out a smaller, simpler diagram from within the luminous map. Tomorrow, today actually, since it's already May 3rd, at exactly 2:30 p.m., Sophia will enter a bookstore in Naples called La Libreria dell'Anima. She'll be browsing the medical section, still uncertain about whether to pursue graduate studies in public health or accept a higher-paying corporate job. At 2:37 p.m., an elderly man named Professor Antonio Marchesi will approach her. He's a retired physician who specialized in tropical medicine and spent 40 years working in Africa. He's also a connector. His specific mission at age 78 is to identify and encourage young people toward a medical missionary work. Professor Marchesi will notice Sophia looking at a particular book on infectious diseases and will strike up a conversation. Over the next 90 minutes, he'll share stories from his medical mission work, explain the desperate need for healthcare workers in underserved regions, describe the profound spiritual satisfaction of serving the poorest of the poor, and offer to introduce Sophia to organizations that facilitate medical missions. By the end of that conversation, Sophia will have clarity about her vocation that she's been seeking for years. The corporate job will lose its appeal, the graduate program will suddenly seem purposeful rather than burdensome, and her entire life trajectory will shift toward medical mission work. "But Mama," Carlo said with that mixture of joy and gravity, "this encounter will only happen if you write to Sophia immediately after I leave, explaining about divine connectors and encouraging her to pay attention to encounters that seem too coincidental. If you don't write, she'll still go to that bookstore, but she'll be so skeptical and self-protective, so convinced these encounters are manipulative or imaginary, that she'll avoid Professor Marchesi, dismissing him as an intrusive old man. She'll refuse the conversation, leave the bookstore early, and miss the connector God positioned for her." "So my letter is part of the chain." "Exactly. You're a connector for Sophia, Mama. Your explanation will prepare her heart to receive Professor Marchesi's guidance. This is how divine providence works. Chains of connections where each connector enables the next connection. God could override her free will and force the encounter, but he doesn't. He respects her freedom while creating optimal conditions for grace through multiple prepared connectors." Carlo spread the diagram wider, showing an impossibly complex network of interconnected souls. "Now let me teach you how to recognize divine connectors, both in your own life and how to become one for others. Every divine connector has 3 distinctive characteristics that make them recognizable. I call them the 3 marks of connection." He held up one finger. First mark, timing precision. Connectors appear at moments of decision, crisis, or transition, not before when their guidance would be premature, and not after when it would be too late. They show up with almost supernatural timing that addresses immediate need. Think about Elena the nurse. She worked at our family physician's clinic for only 3 weeks total, but those 3 weeks perfectly bracketed the window when my symptoms first appeared. If she had arrived 2 weeks earlier or 2 weeks later, she would have missed me entirely. That precision is a mark of divine positioning. He held up a second finger. Second mark, information specificity. Connectors bring knowledge, resources, or opportunities that the person didn't have and often didn't know they needed. It's not generic advice like follow your heart. It's specific, actionable guidance tailored to that person's unique situation. The substitute Scottish doctor didn't give you general pregnancy advice. He gave you specific counsel about travel risk based on my positioning, advice that proved exactly correct. Professor Marchesi won't give Sophia generic encouragement to help people. He'll give her specific information about tropical medicine programs, names of organizations, and personal introductions. That specificity is a mark of divine preparation. He held up a third finger. Third mark, trajectory, alteration. After an encounter with a connector, a person's life direction changes significantly. Not small adjustments, but fundamental redirection toward purposes they hadn't previously considered or had abandoned. After you met Papa, your entire life shifted. You stayed in London instead of returning to Milan, got married instead of remaining single, became a mother instead of pursuing a different career path. After Sophia meets Professor Marchesi, her trajectory will shift from corporate comfort to medical mission sacrifice. That degree of alteration, where looking back, you can identify before bang after moments is the mark of a connector encounter. But Mama, Carlo continued, understanding how to recognize connectors in your own life is only half the lesson. The more important half is learning to become a connector yourself, learning to position yourself consciously as an instrument of divine providence for others. How do I do that? 3 practices make someone available for God to use as a connector. I call them the 3 postures of availability. Carlo stood and began pacing my bedroom with animated gestures, just like he had done as a living teenager when explaining something that excited him. First posture, alert attentiveness. Connectors pay attention to nudges, promptings, and intuitions about when and where to go, whom to approach, what to say. They don't dismiss these as random thoughts. They treat them as potential divine guidance. Remember that morning Papa's coffee maker broke? He later told me that he had an unusual impulse to go to that specific cafe rather than the one closer to his apartment. He almost dismissed it as random preference, but he followed it. That alertness to subtle guidance made him available to connect with you. Second posture, generous engagement. Connectors don't guard their time, information, or resources jealously. They're willing to have conversations with strangers, share knowledge freely, offer help without calculating reciprocity. They understand that every encounter might be divinely orchestrated, so they engage generously rather than protectively. Professor Marchesi could walk past Sophia in that bookstore, minding his own business. Instead, he'll spend 90 minutes with a complete stranger, sharing decades of experience and offering valuable professional contacts, expecting nothing in return. That generosity is what makes him useful as a connector. Third posture, expectant faith. Connectors believe that God actually works through human encounters, so they approach interactions expecting that God might be orchestrating something significant. They're not surprised by coincidences, they're watching for them. When you receive Sophia's letter, you could dismiss it as one of hundreds of requests for guidance. But if you approach it with expectant faith, believing that perhaps God arranged for her letter to arrive exactly when it did, during your preparation for that conference, right before my birthday, then you'll write the response she needs rather than offering a generic reply. Carlo sat back down on my bed, his expression becoming tender. Mama, I know what you're thinking. You're worried this sounds manipulative, like God is controlling people's lives like chess pieces. But it's not control, it's coordination. God coordinates possibilities while respecting freedoms. Think of it like a symphony orchestra. The conductor doesn't force each musician to play. Every musician chooses freely to participate. But the conductor coordinates those free choices into harmonious music. Without coordination, you'd have chaos. But the coordination doesn't negate the musician's freedom. It enhances it, enabling them to participate in something more beautiful than any could create alone. God is the conductor. Human souls are the musicians. Divine connectors are like section leaders who help coordinate their sections, and the music produced is the unfolding of divine providence through history. Billions of free choices coordinated into redemptive patterns. Carlo stood to leave, and I felt panic rising. Wait, will I see you again? Mama, I'm always present, even when you can't see me. But right now, you have specific work to do. Write to Sophia immediately, this morning before breakfast. Explain the 3 marks of connection and encourage her to watch for a connector today. Your letter must reach her before 2 p.m. so she has time to read it before going to the bookstore. And then, he continued, begin teaching this understanding to everyone you meet. Include it in every conference, every interview, every conversation. Create materials explaining the 3 marks and the 3 postures. Help people recognize the connectors in their own lives, and more importantly, help them become connectors for others. In the next 8 months, you'll document thousands of cases. people identifying their connectors, people consciously becoming connectors, entire networks of individuals cooperating with divine providence rather than just experiencing it passively. Carlo moved toward the door, his luminescence beginning to fade. This is the practical side of providence that theologians describe but rarely explain. The actual mechanics of how God positions people to facilitate grace for each other. You're going to make it accessible, teachable, and transformative. One last thing, Mama. The title of your next conference should be Carlo Acutis and the Divine Connectors, Understanding How God Orchestrates Encounters. Use that exact title. It will attract the specific people who need this teaching most. And then he was gone. The room returned to normal. I looked at my bedside clock, 5:47 a.m. The encounter had lasted exactly 32 minutes, the same number of years since his birth to this anniversary morning. But I was completely awake, electrically alert, and filled with urgent purpose. I didn't waste a single minute. At 5:50 a.m., I went to my desk and began writing to Sophia with intense focus, as if Carlo were dictating the words. Dear Sophia, thank you for your letter. What you're experiencing is not manipulation or imagination. It's divine providence operating through what I call divine connectors. Throughout your life, God has positioned specific people to appear at precise moments when you face crucial decisions. These connectors brought information and guidance that redirected your trajectory toward purposes God knows, but you're still discovering. There are 3 marks that identify authentic divine connectors. 1. Timing precision. They appear exactly when you need guidance, not before or after. 2. Information. Specificity. They bring tailored knowledge you didn't have and often didn't know you needed. 3. Trajectory alteration. After meeting them, your life direction changes fundamentally. Sophia, pay special attention to encounters today and over the next few days. If someone approaches you with guidance about your vocational questions, particularly an elderly person with medical experience, do not dismiss it as coincidence. That person may be a connector God has positioned specifically for you. Also consider this. If you've been receiving guidance through connectors, perhaps God is preparing you to become a connector for others. The 3 postures that make someone available for this mission are alert attentiveness to divine promptings, generous engagement with others' needs, and expectant faith that God orchestrates encounters. Your awareness of these patterns isn't paranoia. It's spiritual awakening. Trust the process. With prayers and affection, Antonia Salzano. I finished the letter at 6:15 a.m., immediately scanned it to PDF, and emailed it to Sophia's address. Then I sent an additional message via postal mail for backup, marked urgent. Please read immediately. At 8:30 a.m., after attending daily Mass, I began drafting the conference presentation Carlo had specified. Carlo Acutis and the Divine Connectors, Understanding How God Orchestrates Encounters. I worked with focused intensity, structuring the presentation in 3 sections. Part 1. Recognizing your connectors. Personal testimony of connectors in our family's life, the 3 marks of connection. Exercise. Identify 3 connectors in your own life story. Part 2. Understanding divine coordination. How providence works through natural causation. The balance between divine positioning and human freedom. Why some encounters feel too coincidental to be random. Part 6. Becoming a connector. The 3 postures of availability. Practical exercises for conscious cooperation with providence. How to discern divine promptings versus personal preference. By noon, I had completed a 40-page presentation with handouts, exercises, and reflection questions. I scheduled my first delivery for May 10th in Rome at a parish that had requested a talk about Carlo's spirituality. At 2:45 p.m. on May 3rd, 15 minutes after Carlo had said Sophia would meet Professor Marchesi, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something prompted me to answer. Signora Antonia, a young woman's voice, trembling with emotion. This is Sophia Romano. I just left a bookstore where something impossible happened, and I had to call you immediately. Sophia, tell me what happened. I received your email this morning at 7 a.m. and read it 3 times. Honestly, part of me thought it sounded crazy. Divine connectors, timing precision, trajectory alteration. But something about your conviction made me decide to pay attention today, just in case. This afternoon, I went to La Libreria dell'Anima to browse. I've been struggling with whether to accept a corporate job offer or pursue graduate studies in public health. The corporate job pays 3 times more, but feels hollow. The graduate program feels meaningful, but impractical. I was looking at medical books, still completely uncertain, when an elderly man approached me. Signora Antonia, the timing was bizarre. He appeared exactly as I picked up a book on tropical infectious diseases. He asked if I was interested in that field, and we started talking. Sophia's voice broke with emotion. For the next 90 minutes, this man, Professor Antonio Marchesi, a retired tropical medicine specialist who spent 40 years in Africa, described exactly the vocation I've been unconsciously longing for, but too afraid to articulate. He explained medical mission work with such passion and practicality that it suddenly seemed not just possible, but inevitable. He gave me contact information for 3 mission organizations, offered to write recommendation letters, described specific training programs, and even showed me photos from his time in Uganda. By the end of our conversation, I had absolute clarity. I'm supposed to pursue public health, specialize in tropical medicine, and work in medical missions. But Signora Antonia, here's what's impossible. I checked the time repeatedly during our conversation because it felt surreal. We started at exactly 2:37 p.m., just like you said in your email that a connector might appear today. And Professor Marchesi mentioned casually that he almost didn't come to the bookstore today, but felt an unusual prompting to visit, even though he rarely goes there anymore. Sophia was crying now. It's all real, isn't it? The divine connectors, the timing, the orchestration. God really does position people specifically to help us find our paths. Yes, Sophia, it's absolutely real. And now you understand something crucial. You're not being manipulated, you're being loved. God loves you so much that He coordinates encounters to help you discover the purpose He designed you for. But Signora Antonia, Sophia asked, if I'm receiving help from connectors, does that mean I'm supposed to become one for others? Yes, that's exactly what it means. Your awareness of this system isn't just for your benefit. It's preparation for ministry. As you move forward into medical missions, you'll encounter people at their own decision points, and you'll be positioned to serve as a connector for them. Over the following 2 weeks, I refined the presentation and began delivering it at parishes, youth conferences, and Catholic organizations across Italy. The response was unlike anything I'd experienced in 18 years of sharing Carlo's story. People weren't just inspired by a biography. They were experiencing personal epiphanies, recognizing patterns in their own lives they'd never consciously acknowledged. At the May 10th conference in Rome, a 45-year-old businessman named Marco approached me afterward, visibly shaken. Signora Antonia, I've attended Mass every Sunday for 40 years, but today is the first time I understood how God actually works in daily life. You helped me recognize at least 7 connectors who shaped my career, my marriage, and my family, and you made me realize I've been functioning as a connector for others without understanding what I was doing. Last year, I hired a young woman for an entry-level position in my company, even though she was overqualified. Something prompted me to hire her specifically. Within 6 months, she transformed our entire marketing approach. Yesterday she told me that jobs saved her life because she'd been depressed and directionless before. I thought I was just making a business decision, but I was actually cooperating with divine providence. At a youth conference in Milan on May 17th, a 19-year-old student named Julia shared, "I've been feeling guilty for months because I was accepted to 3 different universities and couldn't decide which to attend. Everyone told me to pray about it, but prayer felt useless. God wasn't giving me a clear sign. But after hearing about divine connectors, I realized that over the past month, I've encountered 3 different people, a professor, a graduate student, and a random person on a train, who each gave me specific information about one of these universities. I thought those were just coincidences, but they were connectors. God was answering my prayers through human encounters, and I was too blind to recognize it. By the end of May 2024, I had delivered the Divine Connectors presentation 8 times to approximately 1,200 people total. I had received 147 emails and letters from individuals reporting their own recognition of connectors in their life stories. But more significantly, 23 people reported actively becoming connectors themselves, consciously positioning themselves to serve as instruments of providence for others. A retired teacher wrote, "After your conference, I started practicing alert attentiveness. Yesterday, I felt an unusual prompting to visit a specific cafe I rarely frequent. While there, I met a young mother struggling with homeschooling decisions. I'm a former educator. I had exactly the information and encouragement she needed. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and she left with clarity and hope. I would have dismissed the prompting to visit that cafe, but your teaching helped me recognize it as potential divine guidance." A nurse reported, "I've worked in pediatric oncology for 15 years and have always tried to comfort families professionally. But after understanding divine connectors, I approached my work differently. Last week, I met a mother whose 8-year-old daughter was just diagnosed with leukemia. Instead of offering generic comfort, I shared my personal story of how my son survived leukemia 10 years ago. The timing was providential. She needed exactly that testimony at exactly that moment. I've become a connector through my own family's suffering." In June 2024, something extraordinary happened that confirmed everything Carlo had taught me. I received an email from Professor Antonio Marchesi himself, the elderly physician who had met Sofia in the bookstore. "Dear Signora Antonia, my name is Antonio Marchesi. I am a retired tropical medicine specialist. Last month, I met a remarkable young woman named Sofia Romano in a Naples bookstore, and we had a lengthy conversation about medical mission work. She later contacted me to explain that you had written to her about divine connectors, and that our meeting was part of a divine orchestration. I'm writing to tell you that Sofia's explanation transformed my understanding of my entire life. I'm 78 years old. I worked in Africa for 40 years, returned to Italy 5 years ago after my wife's death, and have been living in what I would describe as purposeless retirement. I attend daily mass, visit my grandchildren occasionally, and wait for death without much sense of meaning. But 1 month ago, on May 3rd, I woke with an unusual prompting to visit La Libreria dell'Anima, a bookstore I hadn't entered in over a year. I almost ignored the prompting, but it was insistent enough that I went. When I saw Sofia looking at that tropical medicine book, I felt another prompting to speak with her. Normally, I'm quite reserved with strangers, but something compelled me to engage. Our conversation lasted 90 minutes, and I shared more about my African experiences than I had with anyone in years. What I didn't realize until Sofia explained your concept of divine connectors is that this encounter gave my life renewed purpose. I'm not just waiting for death. I'm positioned to identify and encourage young people toward medical mission work. Since meeting Sofia, I've encountered 3 other young people in various contexts where I felt prompted to share my experiences. All 3 are now seriously considering mission work. Signora Antonia, you've helped me understand that retirement doesn't mean uselessness. I'm in a new phase of my mission, serving as a connector to facilitate the next generation of medical missionaries. At 78, I've discovered a purpose I thought I'd lost. Thank you for this teaching. It has resurrected my sense of meaning. Respectfully, Antonio Marchesi. I read that letter 5 times, crying with joy. Professor Marchesi's testimony demonstrated the reciprocal nature of connector encounters. Not only does the person being guided benefit, but the connector themselves often discovers renewed purpose through serving as an instrument of providence. By July 2024, the teaching had spread beyond my direct presentations. Other speakers began incorporating the divine connectors concept into their own talks. Parish priests mentioned it in homilies. Catholic websites published articles explaining the 3 marks and 3 postures. A Catholic publisher approached me about writing a book specifically on this topic. Most significantly, I began receiving testimonies documenting chains of connections, cases where one person became a connector for someone else, who then became a connector for a third person, creating visible networks of providence. One such chain began with a woman named Elena from Turin, who attended my May 10 conference. After learning about divine connectors, she recognized that her former professor had served as a connector during her college years, directing her towards social work. Inspired by that recognition, Elena consciously positioned herself to become a connector for others. In June, Elena met a young man named Davide who was struggling with addiction. She spent hours listening to his story and connected him with a specific treatment program. Davide entered recovery and 6 weeks later encountered another young man at a support group meeting who was contemplating suicide. Davide, remembering how Elena had served as a connector for him, engaged the suicidal young man with generous attention and connected him with crisis counseling. That young man survived, entered therapy, and 3 months later encountered a teenager from his church youth group who was experimenting with drugs. He served as a connector, sharing his own story and directing the teenager toward help before addiction became entrenched. One initial connector encounter, Elena learning the concept and positioning herself, generated a visible chain affecting at least 3 subsequent lives. And those 3 would likely become connectors for others, creating an expanding network of providence. By September 2024, 6 months after Carlo's visitation, I had delivered the Divine Connectors presentation 47 times to approximately 7,800 people total, received 1,147 documented testimonies of people recognizing connectors in their own lives, collected 467 reports of individuals consciously becoming connectors for others, identified 23 visible chains of connection, where one connector encounter generated multiple subsequent connections. The teaching had been translated into 7 languages and was being presented by other speakers in Spain, Portugal, France, Poland, and Brazil. A bishop in Brazil wrote, "Signora Antonia, your concept of divine connectors has revolutionized pastoral ministry in my diocese. We've trained parish leaders to recognize and become connectors intentionally. Our parishes are reporting increased engagement, more meaningful pastoral relationships, and greater sense of divine purpose among ordinary lay people who previously saw themselves as passive recipients of sacraments rather than active instruments of providence." A youth minister in Poland reported, "Young people resonate powerfully with the connector concept because it gives them concrete purpose. Instead of vague exhortations to evangelize, they now understand they can cooperate with God's providence by being attentively available for orchestrated encounters. Our youth group has grown from 12 members to 43 in 4 months because word spread that we're teaching practical spirituality rather than abstract theology." In October 2024, I traveled to Assisi for the 4th anniversary of Carlo's beatification. During the commemorative Mass, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, Archbishop of Bologna, and president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, delivered the homily. He spoke about Carlo's influence on contemporary youth evangelization, his Eucharistic devotion, his use of technology for spreading faith. But then he said something that made me catch my breath. Blessed Carlo Acutis understood intuitively what his mother Antonia has recently articulated systematically, that God orchestrates encounters through what she calls divine connectors. Carlo himself functioned as a connector during his brief life, connecting people to the Eucharist, connecting technology with evangelization, connecting the documentary precision of cataloging miracles with the devotional passion of Eucharistic adoration. He showed us that sanctity isn't isolation from the world, but strategic positioning within it to facilitate divine purposes. After the Mass, Cardinal Zuppi approached me. Signora Antonia, I want to invite you to present the Divine Connectors teaching to our National Bishops' Conference in January 2025. This understanding could transform how we approach pastoral ministry, vocations promotion, and lay formation. You've articulated the practical mechanics of providence in ways that make cooperation with God's will accessible rather than mystical. Today, January 29, 2025, 8 months after Carlo's visitation on his birthday, I have documented 3,247 cases of people recognizing divine connectors in their lives and 882 reports of individuals consciously becoming connectors for others. But beyond the numbers, what moves me most is the transformation in how people understand their daily encounters. Catholics who previously saw their lives as random sequences of events now recognize divine patterns. Ordinary lay people who felt spiritually passive now understand they can actively cooperate with providence. Young people who struggled with purpose now see themselves as potential connectors whose availability might fundamentally alter someone else's trajectory. The teaching has also transformed my personal spirituality. I approach every encounter now with expectant faith, wondering if this person might be a connector for me, or if I'm being positioned as a connector for them. My conversations have depth they lacked before, because I'm attentive to divine promptings about whom to approach, what to share, how to engage. Last week, I was in a Rome bookstore, not coincidentally but following a distinct prompting, when I encountered a young priest who looked discouraged. Something prompted me to approach him and we talked for 40 minutes. He shared that he was considering leaving the priesthood because he felt ineffective and purposeless. I explained the divine connectors concept and suggested that perhaps his ineffectiveness was actually effective in ways he couldn't see, that even seemingly unsuccessful pastoral encounters might be contributing to chains of connection whose fruit wouldn't be visible for years. By the end of our conversation, he had renewed hope and determination to continue his vocation. 3 days later, he emailed me, "Signora Antonia, you were a connector for me at the exact moment I needed one. But here's what's remarkable. The day after our conversation, I encountered one of my former parishioners who I thought I had failed years ago. She told me that a single conversation we had 5 years ago, which I barely remembered, had been the turning point that saved her marriage. I had been a connector without knowing it, and meeting you helped me understand that invisible effectiveness is still real effectiveness." Carlo orchestrated everything with the same precision he brought to cataloging Eucharistic miracles and programming websites. He waited until I was preparing a conference on providence, until Sophia had written her letter, until his birthday anniversary created symbolic resonance. And then he revealed the practical mechanics behind what theologians describe abstractly. The Divine Connectors teaching isn't replacing traditional Catholic doctrine. It's making it experientially accessible. People aren't learning new theology. They're learning to recognize theological realities already operating in their lives, and the fruit continues multiplying. Each person who learns to recognize connectors becomes more attentive to divine guidance. Each person who consciously becomes a connector generates encounters that might produce multiple subsequent connections. The network of providence becomes more consciously cooperative rather than passively experienced. This morning, I used the prayer practice I've developed over these 8 months. Lord Jesus, I acknowledge that you orchestrate encounters for purposes I cannot fully see. Make me attentive to divine promptings about where to go, whom to approach, what to share. Position me to serve as a connector for anyone who needs the specific gifts, experiences, or knowledge you've given me, and help me recognize connectors you send into my life, receiving their guidance with grateful openness rather than skeptical resistance, through the intercession of Blessed Carlo Acutis, who understood divine coordination intuitively. Amen. After praying, I felt a distinct prompting to email a particular conference organizer in Madrid, whom I hadn't contacted in months. The prompting was clear enough that I immediately wrote the email, offering to present the Divine Connectors teaching at their next youth conference. Within 2 hours, she responded, "Señora Antonia, your email arrived at the exact moment I was praying about whom to invite for our April conference. We need precisely this teaching, practical spirituality that shows young people how to cooperate with God's providence actively rather than passively hoping for guidance. This timing is providential." I smiled, recognizing the pattern. I was being positioned as a connector for that conference organizer, who would position me as a connector for the youth attending, some of whom would become connectors for others, extending the chain infinitely. And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and transformative content to more lives that need this word. My name is Antonia Salzano. I am 54 years old. I am the mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis, who died at age 15 on October 12, 2006, was born on May 3, 1991, and was beatified on October 10, 2020. On May 3, 2024, the 33rd anniversary of his birth, Carlo revealed to me the divine system operating behind casual encounters, showing me that God designates certain souls as divine connectors, whose mission includes appearing at precise moments to direct others toward their destinies. Those connectors operate according to recognizable patterns: timing precision, information specificity, and trajectory alteration. And anyone can become a connector by adopting 3 postures: alert attentiveness, generous engagement, and expectant faith. Over the past 8 months, thousands of people have learned to recognize their own connectors and, more importantly, have consciously positioned themselves to become connectors for others. The result is an expanding network of consciously cooperative providence, human souls serving as willing instruments of divine purposes, creating visible chains of connection that demonstrate God's intimate involvement in the specific details of individual lives. Carlo continues his mission from heaven, not through distant intercession, but through active orchestration, positioning people, creating encounters, coordinating circumstances that respect human freedom while facilitating divine purposes. Every person you meet might be a connector sent specifically for you, and you might be a connector sent specifically for them. The question isn't whether God orchestrates encounters. He does, constantly, billions simultaneously. The question is whether you'll develop the spiritual awareness to recognize these orchestrations and the generous availability to cooperate with them consciously. This is Carlo's revolution, making ordinary people conscious participants in divine providence rather than passive recipients of random chance. And that revolution continues, one connector at a time, one encounter at a time, one transformed life at a time.